Right? We understand that this past election had everything to do with our economic insecurities. Right? That even with the black man in the White House, Wall Street is booming, right, while Main Street still struggles to figure out how they're going to make ends meet. Right? Wages have ticked up just a bit, median household income just a bit, but everyday ordinary folk trying to figure out, y'all know this in Cleveland, in the Rust Belt, trying to figure out how they're going to make ends meet. Economic insecurity, people trying to figure out why is it that they're working harder for less? How is it that my house isn't worth anything? How is it that I can't afford education for my kids? How is it that if one of us gets sick, everything falls apart? Economic insecurity as one vector. And then, of course, there's white insecurity. You know, middle America, I don't know. Middle America looks pretty diverse to me. But, you know, Joe Scarborough's always telling me, it's about the Central Time Zone. It's like, well, damn, Joe, I grew up in the Central Time Zone. Right? But the insecurity of white Americans, right? That somehow, as Kathy Kramer has argued, that what has happened since the Civil Rights Revolution is that big government has been taking things from well-deserving white people and giving it to meritless people of color. So we're busting our behinds and working hard, and our houses aren't worth anything, and our salaries have flatlined, and the manufacturing jobs that gave us a middle-class existence, they're gone, and they're gone not just because of NAFTA, but because of automation. And I can't figure out how I'm going to live, and I look at this black man at Princeton with a Hickey Freeman suit. What's going on? And then you think about Barack Obama won the presidency with only 38% of white folk voting for him. That the demographic revolution that will define the browning of America isn't something in the distant future. It's happening right now, that more black and brown babies were born in the United States than there were white babies. That Trump did not expand the electorate in any substantive way. That he got perhaps just a little bit more than the percentage of white voters who voted for Mitt Romney. That the demographic data is actually quite clear. Hillary Clinton lost in part because of voter suppression and because young millennials voted third party, not because Trump did anything different. White insecurity joins with economic insecurity, and then the third vector, of course, is Trump's own insecurities. This is the age of Trump, the age of insecurity, overdetermined by the reality of the value gap. So one way of reading, I believe, the Black freedom tradition and its latest instantiation in the Black Lives Matter movement is as an attempt to close the value gap, and that's going to have to happen under different conditions as a new policing regime defines the landscape. So their efforts to expose the ways the value gap limits our capacity for generosity, our sense of humility, our idea of benevolence and mutuality, and how all of it, how our ideas of justice are limited by the belief that white people matter more than others. In other words, how the value gap undermines democratic virtue, gets in the way of the formation of the kinds of characters, right? The character, the disposition that democracy requires. My favorite philosopher, John Dewey, once wrote, "As moral persons, we wish the fullest life possible to ourselves and to others. And the fullest life means largely a complete and free development of our capacities in knowledge and production of beauty and use. Our interest in others, then, is not satisfied as long as their intelligence is cramped, their appreciation of truth feeble, their emotions hard and incomprehensive, their powers of production compressed. To will their good is to will the freeing of all such gifts to the highest degree," end quote. Now, what we know of our nation's history and the present state of our country under Donald Trump is that this wish has rarely been extended to the darker peoples of this country. And that for some reason, a certain segment of this country, in certain areas of this country, it seems like white folk have lost their damn minds. So democracies require particular kinds of disposition. I don't know why y'all invited me here. I'm gonna tell the truth. Right? I'm pointing at Dan, so I'm sorry. Democracies require particular kinds of dispositions to work admirably, but something has distorted and disfigured our national and individual character. We talk about the achievement gap, we talk about the wealth gap, we talk about the empathy gap, but underneath it all is the value gap. And the value gap is the fundamental belief that white people matter more than others. And that belief, and the notion of belief here comes out of my reading of Charles Sanders Peirce. Belief is thought as rest. Belief is thought at rest. But this belief that white people matter more than others has always constrained the way in which we imagine democracy in this country. Just think about John Adams saying to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment he gives voice to an idea of freedom, it's predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom. At the very moment in which we give voice to the principles of liberty, freedom, and equality, we reconcile it with racial slavery, limiting its extension. When we talk about immigration today, we can go back to the first Immigration Naturalization Act of 1790. It had something to do with this being a white nation, limiting the extension of democracy to people. See? At the very moment in which we give voice to democracy is limited and constrained by an assertion that white people matter more. Let's go to the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, a moment of genuine multiracial democracy. What happens in the face of it? We get convict leasing.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Brothers and sisters, I hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. So today we are embarking on discussing an important topic. I'm sorry guys, I know it's been a crazy week and yeah, everybody is going through something, right? And today I want us to embark on something that's really important that I feel like we need to talk about. You know, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. talks about something, a concept which is so important. He talks about the value gap, right? And me noticing that this is something that a black person like me, I've been living with for the longest time. And the focus that he focuses on is the value gap, that the belief that black people feel like white people, their life is inherently valuable as compared to theirs. This has harnessed self-hate in the black community. This has harnessed people not liking each other. And it talks about something so important. And this concept reveals itself in different spheres of human lives along different racial lines. This is an important aspect that he tries to talks about. Now, Dr. Eddie Glaude's concept of the value gap focuses on the persistent belief that white lives are inherently more valuable than the black lives in American society. He argues that this gap isn't just a byproduct of past policies, but remains embedded in modern institutions, practices, and attitudes influencing nearly every aspect of life, including economics, politics, and education. Now, according to Glaude, the value gap manifests through disparities in wealth, access to quality education, housing, healthcare, and black communities are policed. This hierarchy of human worth leads to unequal opportunities and systemic injustices, reinforcing racial inequality by keeping power structures titled in favor of white folks. Now, inside the video, he further explains that the value gap isn't only about individual prejudice. It's maintained through systems that prioritize white well-being, comfort, and success over black lives. This framework underpins discussion on racial inequality, showing how Americans' ongoing struggle with racial injustice is deeply tied to closing this gap, not just by changing laws, but by transforming how society values people across racial lines. And I think that this is an important concept that I feel like we need to discuss about. I feel like we need to talk about, because in the black community, we find ourselves falling into this habit of not loving ourselves, not knowing that we are as valuable as other racial lines might think that they are. And this has manifested in different ways. We fighting against each other. A number of black folks going and getting, different wives from different racial lines just to prove themselves, right? And in as much as we might be going through what is called the Stockholm syndrome, that we want to relate so much with our oppressor because that's what the system have always showed us, or that's what the system have showed us to believe for the longest time. The Stockholm syndrome comes in different shapes and different forms. For example, in our society today, sorry if I'm taking long in the intro, we have black footballers, we have black basketballers. These are people that I know relationship, that's something which is personal, but look at it systematically. Look at it like something, just give it a different lens. You'll come to understand that most successful black folks will not want to be or to marry a black person. This is because of the self-hate that we have. This is because the value gap that manifests through our lives each and every day. This is what Dr. Glaude Anderson is trying to talk about. I hope that this video serves to write wherever you are, buckle up. I'll be back with my commentary at the end of the day. These are presented Jintek Stories, and if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, like, and you can check out my Cash App account. If you want to buy me a coffee, I'll most definitely appreciate the support that you're trying to give me. Until then, let's dive right into the video. I'll be back with my commentary. You know how we do it.
Another form of slavery. Birmingham would not be Birmingham if it wasn't for the labor of conscripted black folk for vagrancy laws and the like. And what else do we get? We get Jim and Jane Crow. Racial apartheid in the South. The value gap. A moment of advance. And then let's think about the mid-20th century. Everyday ordinary people standing up, demanding that they be treated as first-class citizens. And what do we get in response? We get the tax revolt of Northern California. Attack on wholesale, the notion of government, right, is by definition bad because the face of welfare becomes black. Not those New Deal Dixiecrats who were fighting for poor white folks in Mississippi and Alabama, but once government took itself to be trying to uplift everyday ordinary black folk, suddenly this became a problem, right? A reassertion of the value gap. And in 2008, Dan, we elect our first black president. And what happens? The vitriol of the Tea Party immediately. A spate of attempts to pass voter ID laws and voter suppression all around the country immediately. And then, of course, it all culminates with the election of Donald Trump. The value gap. In each instance, in each one of these moments, there's genuine progress. In each moment, there's genuine progress. So when you hear black folks say, right, nothing has changed, we know something has changed. My daddy couldn't go or attend Princeton University. Now his baby has an endowed chair at Princeton. Something has changed. But what hasn't changed, right, is the way in which the value gap is articulated under different material conditions. You see, you hear Cornel West in me? Under different That's my man. That's my man. Under different material conditions. The value gap. And remember, the value gap, listen, the value gap, because I got 2 minutes. The value gap isn't the possession of loud racists. In the context of the book, what I do, the first half of the book is really kind of to describe the Great Black Depression, all the hell that black folk have been catching and continuing to catch while we had a black man in the White House. While people were kind of celebrating this achievement, all hell was breaking loose in our communities in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of criminal justice. We were burying our babies while this black man was in the White House. Babies killed at the hands of police. I don't need to bring this up in Cleveland. And then I was trying to figure out, well, how is the case? And well, then the value gap came to mind that in this country, certain lives are valued more than others. And what does that mean? It has an impact on our character formation, right? And so the next chapter is that it's racial habits, right? That the value gap isn't the possession of loud races. We're looking for the alt-right, That's just a nice way of talking about white supremacists and white nationalists. We're looking at these bad people as if we're watching All My Children, as if it's melodrama where you can identify the bad people. And when in fact, the value gap is, as my colleague Imani Perry says, it's part of a cultural practice of racial inequality. We all participate in it. Black, white, green, purple, yellow. It's all part. We've all been habituated in this idea that some people are valued more than others. That's all you got to do is drive around the built environment of Cleveland, as Clarissa Haywood says. That's all you got to do is drive around Princeton. If you come to Princeton, I'll take you straight down the Witherspoon Street, and you'll learn race immediately, just by moving through space and time. We're habituated into believing in the value gap. And what does Aristotle say is the definition of character? The interpenetration of habit. Our habits impact our dispositions. You see? So the value gap is not just simply about bad people over there and good people over here, and then we can denounce the bad people and then we can feel good about ourselves. In fact, it cuts much deeper than can we all get along. Give you an example really quickly, 1 minute. I believe the planet is getting warmer. Yes? We're in Cleveland in February. This year was the hottest year on record. Last year was the hottest year on record. The year before that was the hottest year on record. I'm not a climate change denier, trust me. But if you look at my house, you look at the car I drive, you look at the light bulbs in my crib. For those of you who don't know what crib is, a house. You look all around my lifestyle, you would think I thought the planet was just fine. We're looking for the big bad racists, but the ways in which the racial inequality, the ways in which it's reproduced has everything to do with our daily choices. I just want my kids to go to the best schools. Social science data has revealed that what that means is we want to know how many black and brown kids go to that school, right? I just want my house to be worth something. I want to live in a safe environment. We have all of these proxies for talking about race without talking about race because we're afraid. But I'm with Malcolm on this, Bridget. Stop sweet talking. Tell them what kind of hell you've been catching. And let them know if they're not ready to clean up their house. If they're not ready to clean up their house, they shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down. Now that scares the hell out of people. And I'm not talking about burning down anybody's houses. But if we're going to address the value gap, we're going to have to embrace frank speech. We're going to have to be able to speak the suffering into existence. We're going to have to confront the ugliness of who we are as a nation and who we have been. Because if we don't, if we continue not to confront who we are monstrous. Monstrous. So part of what I argue is that we need a revolution of value. Everyday ordinary people, black, white, all of us need to join together and demand a different idea of government. Demand a different conception or an idea of black people, which means we have to kill the idea of white people. There's a wonderful line I've been puzzling over in Jimmy Baldwin. He says, I've been loved by a lot of people, and some of them happen to be white. Trying to figure out what he means by that as a moral claim. What does it mean? What does he mean by that? So we're going to have to kill an idea of whiteness in order to liberate us from the shackles of color. This is not an easy universalism. It's something much more profound. And lastly, this revolution of value is going to require, right, that we change what ultimately matters to us. Donald Trump is just simply an exaggerated indication of the rot that lies within all of us. He is a reflection of us. And it's easy to fall into the kind of melodrama of that's the bad guy. Suddenly, deportation is bad. Barack Obama was deporting a lot of people. He was deporter in chief. What does it mean to be committed to this justice work? It doesn't matter what color the person is. You got to be committed to this justice work, right? And so part of what it involves is, to me, uprooting the value gap, closing the value gap, uprooting those racial habits that give the value gap life, addressing the fear that is its motor, requires of us a kind of democratic politics where we have to tend to each other. We have to tell the truth to each other. We have to accept the humanity of each other. And we're going to do that in struggle over democratic principles, over democratic life, in the midst of struggle. That's how it's done. And so I'm out of time. I was given a hard stop. The only way we can become the kinds of people that Lincoln's version of democracy requires, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, is that we have to embrace with love all the people. All right? All right, let's go. Let's have some questions. Next week and see if you got
that. The radio audience should know that was a standing ovation. I'm Dan Malthrop, CEO of the City Club, and today we're enjoying a forum with Dr. Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. Dr. Glaude appears today as part of Stokes Honoring the Past, Inspiring the Future, which is a series of programs throughout the community, not just here at the City Club. City Club of Cleveland is proud to be a partner in the year-long community-wide commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Carl Stokes' election as mayor of Cleveland. Mayor Stokes and his brother, Congressman Louis Stokes, played key roles in the advancement of the city and the nation through the civil rights movement and beyond. And they were frequent speakers here at the City Club of Cleveland. We're about to begin the Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our team will work it into the program. We want to remind you again that your questions should be brief and to the point. Holding our microphones today are content coordinator Teddy Eisenberg and our director of programming, Stephanie Jansky. May we have the first question, please? Seriously?
Right there. Here's one right there, Doc.
Thank you.
They're not going to give it to you.
Oh, that's right. Forgot the rules. Thank you for that commentary.
Sure.
One of my concerns with leaders like Trump is that they do a great job in creating division among different groups of people who in any other circumstances would be friends and colleagues. How do the good among us who bear different races, who fought this fight and continue to fight it, how do we remove the wedge that on the surface looks like it's real and find each other and then coalesce to continue the fight?
That's a great question, and we have examples. I always lift up the Forward Together movement in North Carolina. And the Forward Together movement in North Carolina with Reverend William Barber as one of its major representatives, they found themselves after 2008 ground zero for a kind of conservative backlash. And that ground zero meant that they were going to be inundated with Koch brothers money. And what happened is not only did they, conservative extremists, we want to distinguish between conservatives and conservative extremists. Conservative extremists seized the governor's mansion and seized the state legislature, proceeded to gerrymander and create supermajorities so that the state legislature would look the way it looked. And one of the things that happened is that, rural people in eastern North Carolina suddenly lost the ability, they were losing their hospitals. So they're sick, couldn't go to the hospital because of the state's refusal to accept ACA and the cutbacks. And so Reverend Barber and organizers found themselves going out in those sundown towns that are still in effect and organizing and mobilizing with everyday ordinary white brothers and sisters who were catching hell. And they joined together. And I remember going down there on one of the last year in Raleigh, North Carolina, and over 80,000 people got together and they marched, and it cut across undocumented workers, LGBTQI, people who were concerned about public education, people who were concerned about women's rights to choose, folks who were concerned about, and it was a cross-section of folk right? And it was decidedly anti-racist. They didn't ask the black folk to leave the particularities of their suffering at the door as a kind of condition for the coalition politics. So Reverend Barber's fond of telling me, if you want to know how to respond to the conservative extremism of Trump, come talk to us because we've already experienced Trump before Trump got elected. And what happened? Just recently, another march in North Carolina of over 80,000 people. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Folks in Charlotte have been working their behinds off in order to resist the conservative extremism of the state government in terms of the bill around, people call it the bathroom bill, but it's much more than that. It's about being able to sue for discrimination. It's about being able to organize. It's about setting a livable wage, all of these sorts of things. They've been working in that regard. They won the governor's mansion back. They put a black man on the Supreme Court, right? So all of this has happened over the course, as they've been, as we like to say, out there fighting lions with a switch, but they're winning, right? So that's an example of the kind of work we can do. When you look at all those women, the women's marches, 2.9 million people gathering. It's amazing. And you see the cross-section of the leadership from Linda to, so these are young women, Muslim, right, LGBTQ. These are some amazing people, and that was a massive data grab. People forget. 2.9 million people were there. They said, everybody, if you're here, text this number. And you text the number, and immediately you got a text. And then that text asked you, you hear that Mississippi accent, asked you for your email address. And then you sent them the email address, and then as soon as you sent the email address, you got the first 10 actions over the first 100 days. So all of these town hall folks showing up, it's not AstroTurf, that's grassroots organizing. That's grassroots organizing. And let's be clear, I'm gonna get shorter with my answers, I promise. We need to be, how many people didn't vote in the last election? 90 plus million folks didn't vote. So that's the first thing. Clinton already whipped him in the popular vote. Then you combine that with the folk who voted for the Libertarian Party and for the Green Party. You have to understand where we are as a nation. That the representation of the election of Trump as somehow defining who we are is actually not true. On the ground, it's not true. Right, 70,000 votes, a little over 70,000 votes, 3 states. Right, and I did not vote for Hillary Clinton. I said it. Because you can keep track of different kinds of evils, can't you? At the same time, right? See, now I'm not so endearing anymore. If you're committed to this justice work, you got to understand what Clintonism has done to everyday working people. You have to be mindful of what Clintonism has done to the Rust Belt, what Clintonism has done to folks on the coast of Mississippi, and how Clintonism evidenced itself through, the Center for American Progress and its shadow government and how it went in 2008 and what they did. Huh? So, it's easy when you live in a melodramatic world to throw everything at the lap or the feet of Donald Trump. We need to reimagine American democratic politics from the ground up. But we can talk about that. I was going to ring the bell. Any more questions? Now y'all can come at me. I got one over here. Hey,
yes.
brother, how you doing?
Hello. My name is DeAndre Harris. I'm a senior at New Tech East. And my question to you today is, what inspires you to dig deeper into the study of democracy?
First of all, thank you for being here. All of you. All of you. You know what? It's my mom and my dad. My dad was a postman. He delivered mail in Mississippi heat. And back in those days, if you worked at the post office, that's high cotton, right? Right. So my dad, no matter what it was, he fixed the same lunch every day, a bologna sandwich with mustard on it. I can't stand bologna. So the way, and in the midst of working hard and taking care of 2 children who weren't his, but raised them as if they were. And then on top of that, my mother, who's had to take care of a child for 53 years, because when she had our first daughter in the 9th grade, she had a bout of German measles. And so my oldest sister can't walk, can't talk, can't see, can't hear. So every day before we had to go to school, we had to feed her. Every day when we got home from school, we had to feed her. My sister grew up with her. So there's a sense in which a kind of concern for the least of these, an outward concern beyond one's own selfish considerations, having to do with how my father expressed his duty day in and day out in raising us to be who we are. And then in the midst of all of that, he was a shop steward, and then became the leader of his union, the local letter carriers union in Pascagoula, Mississippi. He was the second black man hired in Pascagoula. And my dad doesn't suffer people easily. So it was in the context of that intimate space that I came to understand what it meant to stand up for myself. I'll give you a quick example. Miss Davis, my 4th grade teacher, didn't like the fact that she had a precocious black kid in her class. And I remember standing up, screaming, "You're a racist," and walked out the room. Remember I said my dad doesn't suffer fools easily? I thought I was gonna get killed when I got home. And this man who didn't say a word to me, who to this day can give me a look at the age that I am and can send shudders through me, said to me, "What did she say?" And I told her what she said. And he said, "Now every time you hear something like that, you do the same damn thing." That's where it came from. He's the same guy, too, that when they shot out, when we moved into our new house on the other side of town, we crossed the tracks. I tell this story all the time. We crossed the tracks, and he bought a new house, and the kids back in the backyard, in the house behind us, shot out the back window with a pellet gun. He responded with a 12-gauge shotgun and blew off that magnolia tree and said, "Shoot back here again." You know, and it was the first time in that neighborhood I was playing with my Tonka truck. I've told this story before. I was playing with the Tonka truck. And you know those old Tonka trucks? And all of a sudden I heard, "Stop playing with that nigga." And it was my new friend's dad. And it was the first time I had been called that word in that context. Y'all get the joke, right? Somebody did, right? That context, right? So I went in and told my dad. My dad's a Vietnam vet, always had his 38 on him, ran outside. And then I said, typically I say, that's the way you tell the story of American racism, right? Some child gets called a name, the N-word, by some mean-spirited adult, and then that child has to spend the rest of her life proving that she's not that. But at the age of 8, I already knew we were moving from the black side of town to the white side of town. Because my old neighborhood, when it rained because of bad pipes, it flooded. The houses were smaller, the schools weren't as good, the sidewalks weren't paved, the baseball diamond wasn't cut. I had already learned in the spilt space that the value gap, getting called the N-word, was just icing on the cake. You see what I mean? So yeah, that's a long-winded answer. Anybody? Yeah, how you doing? I'm gonna be real quick.
Okay.
I'm lying. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you for speaking to all of us. I really appreciate it. I'm starstruck. Honestly, my name is Marina Zimic. I am a student at Cleveland State University. I'm an aspiring educator in the Cleveland School District. Can't imagine anywhere else. The question I have for you was, how can everyone in this room, my future students, my students that I have now, how can we as a people individually fight and eradicate these cultural habits that you suggested that we had, and how can we eradicate that so we can just get rid of this value gap, because it's
That's what
disgraceful.
That's the hardest thing, right? So it's not going to happen just tomorrow, right? We're going to have to figure out how do we struggle together. The second half of Democracy in Black is a conversation that I staged in my head between two of my favorite theorists. One is Sheldon Wolin, the late Sheldon Wolin, and the other is Miss Ella Baker. And Miss Baker had, even when she was losing her memory, and folk would come see her, and the first thing she would ask them was, "Who's your people?" And it was reflective of a certain kind of politics that Wolin describes as a politics of tending. A politics of tending. That in the context of local struggle, right, we build relationships, right? We build a connection with each other that allows us to see ourselves, to see one another, right, in a different sort of, so we can build mutuality, to build civic friendship in the context of individual struggle, right? Not when somebody comes in to lead everybody, right? But to do exactly what Ms. Baker suggested, right? To create the conditions under which we all can see that we're the leaders we've been looking for. And that requires in so many ways that you and I can struggle together where you can see me for who I am. Not as, it's like that joke that Ralph Ellison used to say, yo, Jack, somebody lives under the stereotype. Somebody's under here, right? So you have to do that in the context of some specific struggle, right? It's right in front of you. It could be the public schools, right? It could be around criminal justice and policing. We're gonna have to do some work, y'all, around policing. They're about to change the game, right? And we're gonna have to protect those folk who are out in the streets, challenging them, because they're gonna lock up they're gonna lock up journalists. You know what they're gonna do for activists, right? So we gotta figure out where we're gonna find, and if you're clear that you don't wanna go to jail, understand your lane. Understand your lane. But the way in which you build genuine relationships is in the context of tending to one another, tending to the human being right in front of you. And it's not something that happens immediately. But what we do know is that it can happen and that it is happening. Does that make sense?
Hi, my name is Kyra Wright. I'm a senior at Bedford High School, and growing up, I was always told by my elders, like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, don't say nothing, don't say nothing. So how can me and like my peers as young people, how can we tell our other peers about, getting rid of the value gap and also those above us, like our elders?
Yeah, that's a real good question. Woo, woo. Dan, I'm trying to translate that sound to the radio audience. I don't know if I can do it. There's the bribe that we all confront. The bribe. And the bribe is, right, that you give me access to a piece of the pie and I take it. And then I become an exception to justify the pie as it is. The bribe. There's a whole cadre of folk in the black political class that have taken the bribe. Some of them are pimping in the name of blackness. Ooh, I'm giving some in-house, I'm saying some stuff that... You gotta tell the truth. I'm so tired of soft shoeing. I'm so tired of dancing the dance. You don't want to get accused of being a racist. I don't want to be seen as angry. So we're dancing a tango. I'm tired of it. So part of what happens is that you have people who are invested in the status quo. They are invested in advocating on behalf of black suffering. That's how they pay their bills. Right? So they don't want you to say what you wanted. They don't want you to say anything. I remember asking Julian Bond this question. He said, when we were in SNCC, we didn't ask for the baton, we just snatched it. We just took it. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Right? Those were the shock troops of the civil rights movement in the bowels of the South, the shock troops. So on the one hand, we got to understand the invested nature of some of the older generation in the status quo. They have become the exceptions. They were invested in the way in which the American theater of race works. Somebody gets policed, something happens, then folks march. We all say, hold people responsible. Some donor gives money to an organization on the sly. I just told the truth. And then they stop marching, and then we wait till the next moment. That's the kind of theater of American racial politics, right? So we have to challenge that. But you can't challenge it by saying stuff that ain't right. This ain't your mama's civil rights movement. Meredith, as soon as you say that, that means you didn't understand your mama's civil rights movement. So part of what we have to do is to begin to build reading habits, to understand the tradition that is the wind beneath our wings, so that we can prepare ourselves, right? So that we can prepare ourselves to enter the struggle. The great thing about youth, right, is that they say the world as it is isn't sufficient. The great thing about older people, the world as it is isn't like what it was. And so there's this in-between space that we have to occupy. but you have to occupy it intelligently, right? So how do you do it? Let's start with some reading groups. Let's start reading substantively, and then let's identify issues that directly impact our community. How are we going to mobilize and organize? And then how are we going to build alliances with other folks? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. How do we build alliances with other folks? You got a youth chapter of the NAACP, take it over. Radicalize it. Youth chapter of the National Action Network, take it over. Radicalize it. And if they don't want you in there, then start something new. You see what I mean? Right? That's a long-winded answer. But you know what, though? You the leader you've been looking for. Oh, my God, what we need today is people not longing for Malcolm, not longing for Fannie Lou. We don't need a nostalgic stance. We need a radical democratic posture in this moment. Sometimes you got to sing off key to be heard. You hear me? All right. I got 5 more minutes. 6 issues. When Dan stands up, it's a wrap. So I know I saw some more questions. Oh, yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Such a pleasure to have you in Cleveland, and thank you for telling the truth.
Thank you.
So you talked about the value gap and how it's so congruent with the idea of democracy, and then you talked about the ravages of the Rust Belt. And I'm very interested in hearing you talk about democracy in the context of capitalism.
So real quickly. 4 minutes, so really quickly. Remember when I said in order to address the value gap, we need a revolution of value. And revolution of value means we're going to have to change our idea of government by changing our demand of government. We have to change our idea of black people by changing our idea of white people, by killing the idea of white people. And we have to change what ultimately matters to us. Now that is my editor at Crown, at a division of Random House, refusing to allow me to use the word neoliberalism or capitalism. So we have to change our idea of what ultimately matters to us. If material acquisition defines the public good, we will continue to produce Donald Trump. We will continue to produce politicians who are committed, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's a corporate Democratic Party that's beholden to Wall Street. Right? We will continue to produce a society where the top 1% will garner the majority of the wealth in this country. 8 of Trump's cabinet members own more than what, 1/3 of Americans. 1/3, 8 people. That's evil. That's not merit. That's evil. And so part of what we have to do is because markets have a role. But we have to have a robust understanding of the public good. What we are seeing right now is this. The extremists are those who have been conspiring to undo the social compact that was the New Deal. They are engaged in it right now at a hyper pace, which means that there is an unraveling of the social safety net and the compact that undergirds it. And if you think because you're secure in your middle class neighborhood, that you're making a little decent living, your little 6-figure money, you think you're secure from the erosion of that, I got an affordable flat in Brooklyn to sell you. You see what I mean? So it requires of us to critique, the economic assumptions that lead us to the conclusion that it's okay to have disposable people among us. Because our current economic system is predicated upon the belief that it's all right that there's some folks out there that are disposable. I think we got, nope, we don't. It's a wrap.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, kings and queens. I hope that we've learned from the video tremendously. Now, a couple of analysis that I might wanna do in this video. That is, equally important that I feel like we need to talk about. And these are systemic issues that Dr. Glaude Anderson Jr., sorry about that, addresses. Now, there are core aspects of the value gap according to Dr. Glaude Jr. I don't know if I said Anderson because I know Dr. Glaude Anderson. He's another black scholar that I always love. Now, let's get into this analysis, right? Now, core aspects of value gap according to Dr. Glaude Jr. Systemic inequality and institutional racism doesn't sound new to you. In fact, it sounds like a deja vu, right? Now, systemic inequalities and institutional racism. Glaude asserts that the value gap is deeply embedded in the country's social, political, and economic systems. It's not merely that individuals harbor racist beliefs, but that laws, institutions, and social norms collectively perpetuate the hierarchy. For instance, policies of housing, education, and employment often create conditions that make upward mobility harder for black people compared to their white counterparts. This institutionalized gap ensures that black communities face greater barriers to achieve the same level of economic stability and social acceptance as white communities. The second thing that I'm going to be talking about is historical roots of enduring legacy. The value gap is deeply rooted in America's history, going back to slavery, segregation, the Jim Crow era, by systematically depriving black peoples of right and relegating them to lower socioeconomic positions. Society established a pattern that continues to influence contemporary disparities. Glaude argues that rather than simply being relics of the past, these historical injustices actively contribute to present-day racial divides as the cumulative effects of disadvantage and discrimination continues to burden black communities. The third thing that I'm also going to be talking about is racial narratives and cultural attitudes. Glaude notes that racial biases are often reinforced through narratives that place black people in roles of inferiority or criminality. Media representation, for instance, tend to portray black individuals through stereotypes that can affect the public perception and policies. The value gap is thus maintained not only by laws and policies, but also by cultural that consciously or unconsciously internalizes and reproduces these biases. The fourth thing that I'm going to be talking about is impact on policymaking and law enforcement. The value gap plays a significant role in policy formation. The value gap, particularly concerning law enforcement and criminal justice. Black communities are disproportionately affected by aggressive policing and incarceration rates, while policies that could help address economic inequalities, such as healthcare and education reform, are often deprioritized. Glaude argues that policies reinforcing white privilege and excluding black progress are indicative of the value gap's power over legislative decision. Now, I tried to look at the insights from other scholars. What did other scholars talk about, like radical people in the society? I'm talking about people like W.E. Du Bois, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michelle Alexander, Ibrahim X. Kendi, James Baldwin. What did they say about this? Now, I'm going to be starting with W.E. Du Bois. Du Bois consciousness. What we call the double consciousness. In his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois discusses double consciousness, the internal conflict black people feel from navigating a society that devalues them. While Du Bois doesn't use the term value gap, he addresses the psychological toll and social alienation resulting from a society that systematically favors white identity and marginalizes the black Identity. This concept of dual identity aligns with Glaude's idea, highlighting how the value gap is not only institutional but also deeply psychological. I'm also going to be addressing Ta-Nehisi's courts, the case for reparations. Coates, in his influential article, The Case for Reparations, builds the concept of historical injustice and their long-term impact on black communities, particularly through housing discrimination and wealth inequality. Coates argues that the economic and social policies harming black people are byproducts of the same value gap Glaude discusses. By making a case for reparations, Coates argues that real equality can exist until there is an acknowledgement and correction of the systemic theft and marginalization that has disproportionately harmed black people. The third person that also says something which is more related with this is Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. Alexander's work emphasizes of how the criminal justice system in the U.S. perpetuates a new form of racial control, describing mass incarceration as a system that continues to subjugate of black Americans under the guise of law and order. She argues that racial profiling, harsh sentencing, and limited opportunities post-incarceration demonstrate a societal tendency to devalue black lives, a perspective closely aligned with the Glaude's gap value concept. The fourth person that also talks about this along the same topic, value gap, is Ibrahim X. Kendi, stamped from the beginning and how to be an anti-racist. Kendi, or Kendai, some people will call him like that, argues that racism is deeply rooted in policy, not simply personal prejudice, echoing Glaude's point about institutional value gaps. Now listen, Kendi's notions of anti-racism, an active commitment to counter racism in all forms, suggest that closing the value gap requires more than awareness. It requires a systemic overhaul of policies and social norms that devalue black lives. He argues that acknowledging and actively challenging the value gap is crucial to dismantling racial inequality. The fifth person and most known, renowned Black American, African American activist is called James Baldwin. And he talks about racial consciousness and critique of American morality. Baldwin argued that American moral framework itself is flawed, as it requires the suffering of black people to maintain its whiteness ideal. His writings highlight the moral contradictions of society that professes equality while continuously creating conditions that devalue black life, both culturally and economically. Baldwin's critique suggests that the value gap persists not only due to ignorance but because there is a deeply ingrained cultural resistance to viewing black and white lives as equally valuable. Now, we're talking about this like theoretically. What are its implications in today's life? You might be asking yourself that question. Implication of the value gap today. Glaude's emphasizes that understanding the value gap is essential to addressing systemic racism because it reveals how ingrained social inequalities are in everyday Americans' life. Bringing this gap requires more than legal reforms or social movement. It demands a fundamental change in how society views race and human worth. Glaude insists that Americans must confront and dismantle this values hierarchy to move towards true equality, a task that requires both institutional reforms and shifts in cultural consciousness. The value gap also underpins many current debates on topics like reparation, affirmative action, criminal justice reforms. For Glaude, real progress can only occur when the country collectively decides to address the moral failures. This gap represents acknowledging the role that historical and current policies play in upholding white supremacy. Right. Now, Glaude, together with other scholars, talks about this in the most phenomenal way. Tell me what you think about this video. As you always know, these are presenter Gintech Stories, and I'm hoping to see you in my next video. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like. You can check out my Cash App account. If you want to buy me a coffee, I'll most definitely appreciate. Until then, let's meet on my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.